Welcome back.
Welcome back. Welcome to episode 2 of Cut Through Nutrition. This is a direct follow-on to episode 1 of Cut Through Nutrition. I'm just going to keep saying Cut Through Nutrition. It's quite fun.
It's catchy.
CTN. Make t-shirts. Welcome to episode 2. Episode 1, we talked a lot about whether food was medicine, and we are both of the opinion that food as medicine is harmful rhetoric, and we should get over ourselves and stop using it. And we're going to take it a little bit further today and explain why being able to analyze biomedical research isn't a transferable skill that I personally thought was, and I personally fell into the trap of thinking that I know how to analyze medical research, and so I should be able to analyze nutritional research.
To nutrition.
Yeah, and I see a lot of fellow doctors having that belief that it's a transferable skill, and that leading to it propagating the food as medicine rhetoric, because if you read nutritional science research in the same way as biomedical science research, and correct me if I'm wrong, it leads you to the theory that food might be medicine.
Well, if you read mechanistic in vitro studies and animal models, yes. Which, when you really scrutinize the populist food is medicine, quote unquote, advocates from the medical sphere, you realize that that is basically the genesis for all of their statements.
Yeah, fine. And I would argue that's why, even though I didn't realize it wasn't transferable, I still came to the conclusion by myself that food as medicine is not helpful, despite the fact of not. So my understanding of the fact it's not transferable has come later. So it's definitely possible to come to an understanding that food as medicine is a bad thing without having this knowledge. However, this knowledge is very helpful. And I would love you to explain to us with some questions from my side, hopefully, as to why there is a difference, why it's not a transferable skill.
Yeah. So I guess the first point of departure is just a basic reminder. Nutrition is a science. So I think
It's its own science.
It's its own science. It's a standalone field. Like the field of psychiatry has the biopsychosocial model, and that evolved out of the biomedical model. And if you read it's an interesting piece in the context of this discussion, but George Engel, who is the godfather of the biopsychosocial model, wrote a seminal paper in the 70s about why the biomedical model was not fit for purpose for that particular field, for investigating conditions of the mind. And so we had this evolution out of that. We need the same, and it is happening. We're in the currency of this process now of people within nutrition publishing and openly talking about, hey, there's fundamental differences between the subject of inquiry of the medical model, which is drugs and surgeries, versus the subject of inquiry for food, which is nutrients. But we build that up. It's not just a food, it's the composite of nutrients and other bioactive components in that food. It's then, does that food exist in the context of a wider diet pattern? And all of these variables that make it a little more problematic to tease out the effects of any given one part of that. So at the most basic level, there are fundamental differences between the subjects of inquiry that make the biomedical model not useless, but somewhat an awkward fit for investigating diet-disease relationships.
It leads to a
overly reductionist.
Exactly. It leads to an overly reductionist view of nutrition, and also leads to a misinterpretation.
Yes.
It doesn't lead to a complete, I have no idea what's going on.
No,
but
not at all.
There's a tendency to overinterpret things based on
or
the previous
misinterpret.
way. Yeah, or misinterpret.
Yeah.
So for me, as somebody who has learned to read biomedical papers, I have been taught multiple times that there is a hierarchy of evidence when it comes to studies, and we're talking biomedical studies here, but for me it was just studies. And there's a hierarchy of evidence going all the way from just anecdotal all the way up to systematic reviews. And along the way, exactly, and a meta, which are amazing. And then they are, when it comes to biomedical, done properly. But so I would come to the Along the way, you come across randomized controlled trials, which if they're double-blinded, placebo-controlled, all of that, you look for the gold standards of how you analyze drugs and how you work out whether drugs are better than placebo.
Yes.
And then if you have lots of those randomized controlled trials, you're then able to create a systematic review. And there's the whole reason why, I hope I'm saying this right, the Cochrane review. Is it Cochrane or Cochrane?
Yeah,
because it sounds kind of Irish,
I think
doesn't it?
I think it's Cochrane Review, but it's about
there's a reason why,
for the most part, it's about as useful for nutrition as a shit-flavored lollipop.
Well, that's why you're here. So there's a reason why, from a biomedical perspective, that's what I look for as a doctor when I come across things. If there's a new surgical procedure, or if there's a new drug that I'm going to use for pain, or there are some very good models that I can use and that we as scientists, medical scientists, can use to analyze these things.
Yeah.
So what's the difference here? Why can't that just go straight? Why can't I take
immediately transfer?
Yeah, why can't I take celery or the compounds in celery and test it against eczema and come to a conclusion, a solid conclusion as to whether or not celery cures eczema?
Yeah.
Why can't I just do lots of randomized controlled trials, get a systematic review, and then have it done and done for all, and
your
give the
confident
medical media my
conclusion
money?
that informs clinical practice?
Yeah, why not?
Okay. So I think the first place to start is the RCT, because the RCT is obviously superior to a population-based study, but it's also then, in the biomedical context, the RCT is the desired study design that is incorporated then into a meta-analysis to come to a confident conclusion on efficacy.
And just because we're hoping that there are people who aren't healthcare professionals or scientists listening as well.
Oh, right, yeah.
Just a brief RCT itself.
Randomized controlled trial.
Okay.
So this is very much a birth child of the biomedical model in terms of the strictures of its approach. And the gold standard is randomized, meaning that the subjects in the trial are either assigned to a placebo or the intervention in a random fashion. So not just there's 12 people, let's go the way you'd pick football teams, right? First person, second person, first person, second person, that kind of thing. It's placebo controlled, meaning that the intervention, let's say we're talking about a drug, is compared to a complete non-entity. So just a powder of flour or something that has no impact.
And in the same method
and in the same method of administration,
so
and you can't tell the difference between the two. And it is controlled in terms of other variables that might influence the outcome. So let's say that we're talking about a trial for a blood pressure medication. Things like salt or anything that could influence that outcome of blood pressure are going to be controlled for, so that when the conclusions of the trial are in, we can be really confident that if blood pressure came down, we can, one, see whether it came down and by how much it came down compared to no intervention, the placebo. And then we can also be confident that the only cause of blood pressure coming down was that particular intervention, i.e. the drug. So that model is based on three what are known as presuppositions for what is known as internal validity. And that is, internal validity in a research sense means minimizing the chance that the result occurred from bias or from other reasons confounding. So those the three primary presuppositions that the randomized control model are based on in the biomedical model is uniformity in the subgroup. So the population you study are all relatively uniform. So that's really easy to define if it's a drug. So we could be talking about people with our blood pressure example that have blood pressure over, for example, 140 over 90.
Because there's no point testing
and they have all of those
with variable blood pressures because it may work for a certain type of blood pressure, a certain level, but not for another.
Exactly. So they're uniform with that presentation. They all have the same rough level of blood pressure. And that means that, again, if blood pressure comes down by 50 mercury millimolars, then we can be pretty confident that that is going to be consistent in people who present with that indication. The second presupposition is that there is a independent effect. And that's where we get to the placebo versus the intervention. And also we get to controlling for other factors that could influence the outcome. What that means is that in the results of that trial, we can be completely certain that the only thing that had the effect was the drug, was the intervention. So independence of effects. And then the third one is a clearly defined intervention and a clearly defined placebo. Okay, so now that you know that, why does that not neatly translate to food? Well, one, in terms of uniformity, it's very difficult to achieve that because everyone comes in with a different baseline diet. So for years, for example, a confounder that was in a lot of the bone health research was people just had different vitamin D baseline statuses. So obviously we understand that now, we can control for that. But you don't know what everyone's baseline nutrient status is in a given trial. You don't know how their underlying health conditions may affect that. And also, because diet interventions are behavioral, you don't always have a uniform group through the intervention. So let's say it's 12 weeks long, diet's going to change. The balance, unless you control for every single variable, you don't have uniformity guaranteed in that group. So that minimizes the validity of the results.
Which is why the best ones that are controlled as much as possible tend to be quite short.
Tend to be very
right?
short,
Because
exactly.
You can't keep someone locked up in a chamber for 2 years.
For 2
because
years.
That, as much as you might want them for 2 years, that just
it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And that's a great point. The tighter the control in nutrition, the shorter the study, basically. And then the second one, independence of effects. Yeah, independence of effect is very difficult to guarantee with diet because diets and foods are nutrients are what we call polyvalent, right? They have multiple structural elements. And they also, so any given food is polyvalent because it has macronutrients in it, proteins, carbohydrates, fat. It has micronutrients in it, vitamin A, for example, vitamin D, vitamin C, whatever. And then it also has other components of the food matrix that have biological activity but are not nutrients. So there's 3 levels of compounds in there, none of which you can control.
Such as what are you talking about in that last?
Bioactive food components. So for example, polyphenols are a group of compounds. So if you look
They don't come under micronutrients?
Blueberries, no, because we don't need them for nutritional status.
I see what you mean, okay, fine.
So they are not required for life. They're not required for lifespan necessarily, but they are having positive influences on health through interactions with signaling pathways and stuff like that. You can't control for all of them. And then the last one then, a clearly defined intervention and placebo. Here's the thing. There is simply no such thing as a nutrient-free state. There is no placebo for food. Unless you're comparing a nutrition intervention to someone who's fasted and hasn't eaten for 3 days.
But that comes with its own confounders.
Exactly. So there's no nutrient-free state. So this isn't to say that RCTs cannot be done well in a nutrition context. They can, but generally what we need to do is be more, there's a spectrum. People also assume that the biomedical RCT is the only RCT, but actually randomized control trials exist on a spectrum from explanatory. So biomedical RCTs are explanatory RCTs because they are trying to explain whether this intervention, this surgical intervention is better, intervention A better than intervention B, or whether drug A is better than drug B, or whether drug A is better than placebo. So it's explaining an outcome. But we also have pragmatic RCTs, which are employed a lot more in the biopsychosocial model and social sciences, where the results may not have the rigor of a biomedical RCT, but have much more applicability in the real world. And that's kind of where we need to get to with nutrition. So biomedical purists hate nutrition science because to them it's just violating all of these principles. But actually, it's not the principles. To say that it's violating these principles and not adapt the model to the subject of inquiry is dogma. What we do in anything with science is we evolve the model to serve the subject of inquiry. And that's where we're at with nutrition now. And that's where most of the commentators are recommending that we don't impose that stricture on nutrition. So that was all very wordy and weighty. So let's just put this into an example for listeners. Let's stick with our blood pressure medication example. We have an RCT in this blood pressure medication, The first thing is the medication, which I've been told, I was calling them ACE inhibitors. That's my lack of medical knowledge. I've been told that they are ACE inhibitors.
ACE inhibitors.
So ACE inhibitor, that acts on the ACE enzyme, and it only does that. It has been designed to have a specific action. It's not going to randomly go off and act on HMG CoA reductase the way a statin does. It's not going to do that. We know how it'll behave.
Yep.
The RCTs,
we know how much gets absorbed based on its method of administration.
Yep.
We know how much of it is bioactive,
Yep.
is bioavailable,
Yep.
and that doesn't change very much with people's overall health. It doesn't change very much with people's microbiome. In general, that's quite well controlled for
how long it will be in circulation,
Yeah.
how quickly it will be eliminated, and how strong and pronounced the effects would be.
Because also nobody has ACE inhibitors in their system, it gets nuanced, but nobody has that same substance in their system already,
right?
Which is a valid point for things like nutrition, where you can't say it's only going to be in the system for so long because that will vary dependent on how much they already have.
Yes, exactly.
At that particular moment in time.
Exactly.
Anyway, go on,
and they're going to have, no, but that's a really good point, because this is going to go into their system. They're going to have a blood pressure of over 140, for example, and this is going to have such a pronounced effect that it's going to act outside of biological range and reduce their blood pressure to what we consider normal, for example. The study population is going to be the same. The drug administered is going to be the same.
If it's a good RCT.
If it's a good RCT. Yeah. And if it's good, this will be replicated over and over multiple times in the same population using similar doses, similar trial duration. Because the effect is so big, we can be really confident that the result isn't random. And then you get all of these trials, and that's when a meta-analysis is incredibly useful for informing medical practice.
Yeah.
Because these trials are all so similar that you can incorporate them into a meta-analysis, and you're not subject to the influence of really outlier studies. So you come to a very confident conclusion on the efficacy of that drug, and that informs clinical practice. So why doesn't that translate for nutrition? Meta-analyses in nutrition have become a bit of a tool for misuse. And part of the reason is because you might have trials that nominally are in the same nutrient, for example, omega-3, but they might be in a different population subgroup. They might use different doses. They might have different baseline levels of intake. They might use different formulations of EPA to DHA, for example. All of these variables, you combine them into a meta-analysis on the kind of trust that you're going to get a confident conclusion. That's not what you get at all. You get an absolute hodgepodge mixed together, and you get a weak or null association. This has been particularly so with epidemiology, with nutrition science, which is also a completely different ballgame because you're analyzing different populations with different levels of intake. So meta-analysis is great in the biomedical model when the trials included are all roughly the same, but certainly nutrition RCTs even fail those basic presuppositions. So it means that the conclusions don't have great external or internal validity.
And interestingly, the meta-analyses that are done tend not to be done by nutritional science researchers.
No.
Which is interesting, right?
Like it is interesting.
The nutritional science researchers are doing the original randomized controlled trials as best as they can.
Or the
and then they're
epidemiology.
leaving it as at that. And then a doctor comes along, a biomedically trained scientist comes along and goes, you know what will make a great publication?
Yeah.
I'm going to create a meta-analysis of all of these studies and I'm going to come to a conclusion. And that's why I started this conversation by saying that the lack of understanding about the transferability of that skill is leading to an encouragement of the food is medicine rhetoric, because you can get a result that may encourage you to think that this particular compound in this particular food could be used in a medical setting.
Yeah.
But the reason you're coming to that conclusion a lot of the times is because a meta-analysis that shows that is being done when it shouldn't be done, and
Yeah.
it's being done by people that don't understand the
Yeah.
reasons why it shouldn't be done.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
it's like, and that's something I
Yeah.
had no clue about.
Yeah.
That's not
And
something we get
there are a
taught.
few
That's-
levels that we can really tease that out on. The first is the over-reliance on. So, because going back to this example we used of the ACE inhibitor, right? That has a really specific mechanism of action, and that mechanism equals effect. So, when that enzyme is inhibited, blood pressure comes down. And I think a lot of doctors start reading nutrition research and they presume that mechanism equals effect, and it doesn't. And for example, research on micronutrients or research on these bioactive food components, often in animal models or cell culture studies. So I'll take an example of resveratrol, right? Because we're drinking red wine as we record this. So
Shh, don't tell anyone that.
sorry. Resveratrol became a really interesting research compound, and you look at it and you put resveratrol in a cell culture study and you have this massive anti-carcinogenic effect, inhibiting tumor growth and all of these mechanisms that you can look at. So that looks like mechanism equals effect. But actually, then you have to step back and extrapolate it back to diet. Where does this and what food sources does it come through? And when we get to that point, then you realize that actually that applicability goes out the window, because it would correspond to around 24 bottles of red wine.
Which is fine if you want to drink that many and cure
and
some
survive.
sort of, then,
Yeah.
you know.
You'll die of
Every
alcohol
day.
poisoning. You may have inhibition of tumors. So we see this a lot. We see this with the recent obsession with turmeric a lot as well, you know, where we're looking at mechanistic studies that are able to circumvent the lack of bioavailability. So with any nutrient or component in food, you have to think about similar enough to a drug in terms of its pharmacokinetics. Think about its absorption. How well is it absorbed? Is its absorption affected by other factors in the diet? Is there competitive transport, competitive inhibition for transport, and all of these factors? And I feel like there's an emphasis on, well, this nutrient has been shown to do this thing in an animal model or in a cell culture study. Therefore, where that nutrient,
or even in a human model, but
even
with humongously high dosage.
really high doses as an isolated supplement. And actually, interestingly, that's why so many people have a lack of faith now in nutrition science, because the biomedical model and its reductionist emphasis meant that when we thought a nutrient was beneficial for health, we isolated it out of the context of when it is and how it is consumed in a diet, encapsulated it as a supplement, gave it to people, and assumed that it would have the same effect as a supplement. And it just isn't. And a great example I use for this is vitamin E. So we have consistent epidemiology that dietary vitamin E intake is associated with lower risk of heart disease and lower risk of dementia and Alzheimer's. And then we can look at mechanistic work to why that may be. And we know that vitamin E is highly concentrated, or the tocopherols and tocotrienols are really highly concentrated in cholesterol and act to protect LDL against oxidation. So that's potentially one mechanism in cardiovascular disease. We know that cholesterol oxidation may be potentially implicated in neurodegenerative disease. So there are these mechanistic underpinnings.
So from a doctor perspective,
Right.
we go, okay, so that's doing all of these positive things, so let's just give vitamin E.
Exactly.
Because that works from a drug perspective.
Exactly. And we did that in multiple, large-scale, really expensive RCTs. But here's the thing. Vitamin E in diet is composed of 8 different isomers. We know a lot about one, alpha tocopherol. We know a little bit about gamma tocopherol. But here's where nutrition gets even more interesting. When you do brain autopsies of patients with dementia or Alzheimer's versus healthy controls, the isomer of vitamin E that's highest concentrated in brain tissue and therefore potentially associated with protection is gamma tocopherol. But we don't really know that much about it. And as for the other 6, we know fuck all. So we have this nutrient nominally, but we don't really know a lot about its overall action and how it might act together when it's consumed in the context of a diet. And so what happened with these trials was they isolated mostly alpha tocopherol, this one isomer of 8, gave it in supplement form, and found nothing. Now, in the strictest sense of the biomedical model, the conclusion, therefore, from these RCTs is that this nutrient has no impact on health outcomes. Of course, that's a farcical proposition from a logical perspective, because that's not the hypothesis that was tested. It's a type 3 error. That's the hypothesis tested was an isolated synthetic version of this nutrient, which is more complex than the supplemental form, protects against cardiovascular disease, for example. So the RCT model doesn't fit particularly neatly. And when meta-analyses are done with really divergent RCTs, we get really weak results, but also in epidemiology. So in nutritional epidemiology, it's important to note that if we're comparing, because there's no nutrient-free state, we don't compare the exposure to no exposure because we can't. So we typically compare high versus low exposures in nutrition science. So let's take saturated fat, for example.
Well, hang on, just going back for 1 second to that isomer example. So I think it's interesting because as doctors, we're aware of this isomer example. Mm-hmm. One perfect one is a drug called thalidomide.
Right.
That was used. It was used as an antiemetic, so an anti-sickness drug in pregnant women at one point. And it seemed to work incredibly well. Mm. And then we realized that it was causing birth defects. Mm-hmm. And we found out that the reason it was causing birth defects is because there were 2 isomers of the drug. Right. So they looked, for people that aren't medical, so an isomer is an identical compound when you kind of look at where the atoms are sitting, but it's the mirror image essentially, or that's one way of looking at it. So this drug had 2 isomers that were mirror images of each other. One version of the drug, both versions of the drug were brilliant at being antiemetic, stopping vomiting, but one version of the drug caused all these birth defects. And so we therefore stopped giving it thalidomide. So, but the problem is that with food, or the way that I'm seeing a lot of this stuff is that where's the harm? So it doesn't matter whether we're wrong about this kind of stuff, whether this all of this stuff that we know is good science, but we're willing to overlook when it comes to food.
Yeah, exactly.
I feel. I don't know. I hope,
you're right, because there's a level of rigor that we want to have, and it's not that we can't have rigor with nutrition science. We can, and it's why I'm quite vocal about these differences in the model of investigation, because we can have rigor and we can have sound recommendations for the population, but these subtle differences are used not because I suppose in the context of a lack of rigor, but in order to mount spurious claims.
Yeah. And you can justify the claims that are made because, it's not like it's causing birth defects.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
So no doctor's
but it could be causing heart disease. So a good example of this is, and you were saying, like medics come along and look at this. There was a meta-analysis that gets thrown around all the time by people who say, we were wrong about saturated fat. Is a 2014 meta-analysis. Exactly. By a group. Chowdhury was the lead author. And it's the most hilarious example of getting it wrong, but looking at everything from a biomedical perspective. Not only did they look at the individual fat subtypes, so saturated, mono, or polyunsaturated, they looked at individual fatty acids. So when was the last time anyone went out and ate a meal consisting of 16 carbon or 18 carbon, stearic acid or,
look, you don't know how functional I'm making my diet.
Yeah.
All right. This is proper biohacking right here.
It's like the last time I ate salmon, I wasn't looking at it saying, that's some 22 carbon docosahexaenoic acid right there. So it was just this.
Are you sure?
It was this farcical distillation of foods into not even the isolated nutrient, but even their subcomponents. And we found no association, and ultimately, here's one of the things. What I was saying, we compare high versus low intake. What does that look like in any given population? So the totality of research we have for saturated fat supports higher total levels of intake, like 16, 17, 18, 19. The UK diet in the 1960s, 20% of energy from saturated fat. The Finnish, 24%. These were high rates. So now, population average around 12%, But if you're going to do some epidemiology, the control group would have to be below 10% because that's our official recommendations, and they come from somewhere. I'm not going to get into it here.
We'll go into that.
But if you want to compare heart disease rates, you need a subgroup of your cohort consuming less than 10%, and you also need a group consuming the level that we know from the rest of the evidence to be problematic. So if you compare a group consuming 14% with a group consuming 11%, of course you're going to get a weak or null finding. And that's what we have in so many studies. Then they're compiled into a meta-analysis, which even further fudges the issue. And an example of this, a recent publication, which again got waved around as, well, there's no association with such. The studies that lent the most statistical weight to the lack of association were Japanese cohorts where, remember I said in nutrition we compare high versus low exposure? The high, and I say this in inverted commas, bunny ears, the highest group consumption in the Japanese cohort, 17 grams a day. Not 17%, 17 grams a day.
It's like nothing.
That's 2 sausages. It's 1 sausage. So
People
consume 3 times that amount in the habitual UK population by having a breakfast roll or by having a fry up in the morning.
Yeah,
and
in
here's
one meal.
the highest intake overall.
And let me guess, they found no difference between the two?
They found a massive reduction in risk comparing a high versus a low intake. The low intake was 5 grams a day. It's a teaspoon of butter. So these primary studies end up included in this analysis look like there's this massive reduction in risk with a, quote, high saturated fat intake, when that high intake is lower than anyone has consumed in the Western world since about 1920. So,
which kind of makes it irrelevant for public health
advice. It's entirely
advice.
Irrelevant.
Yeah.
And it also is a classic example of why meta-analyses of certainly prospective cohort studies in nutrition can be so misleading unless you do your real due diligence.
So
to
can
make
they
sure.
be done okay?
Yes, they can.
Okay.
They can
but
be done well.
But by people that understand nutritional
Yes, exactly.
science.
Because you would have to make sure that if you're going to do a meta-analysis on that question, that the studies included would have a relatively similar high level of intake in terms of what you would define as high. So we would say, let's call high over 16%.
And a relevant high for the
and
population
high.
you're advising from the results that you get.
And you would also look for a control group. So you would look for a cohort that are consuming less than 10%. And that would be your legitimate comparative. You also would try, although it's become popular in recent years, to mix ethnic groups and population cohort studies. I actually don't think that's a sound premise for nutrition science. I know what the thinking behind it is. Oh, well, it gives us a much more broader indication of different diet patterns. But fundamentally, you can't take a cohort of Japanese people eating 17 grams of saturated fat as their highest level of intake and compare it to people in Finland eating 23% of dietary energy from, so.
Could you take it? Could you take people in Finland eating 17 grams? Could you compare?
Yeah, you could.
Ethnicities
if you could find them. Yeah, of course.
Fine,
yeah, if you could find them. This is the point. The population differences make it difficult to come out. So certainly you can. The ethnicity is not the issue. It's that often diet patterns relative to a particular region correspond with a certain dietary level of intake. So an example of that, the Mediterranean diet, which is much vaunted at the minute and everyone looking as the reference healthy diet, and people that are advocates of high-fat diets very much like to flaunt the Mediterranean diet. However, people that are advocates of high-fat diets currently also are advocates of, we were wrong about saturated fat, eat more saturated fat. But you scrutinize the Mediterranean diet, it might be high in total fat. It's still 6 to 9% saturated fat. So the Mediterranean diet's a great control for why lower rates of saturated fat are still, positive for heart health in the context of a higher total fat diet. So there are fundamental differences between drugs and surgeries as a subject of inquiry and food as a subject of inquiry that make nutrition science unique. They make nutrition science a standalone field. And this isn't coming out of nowhere. There is an entire field there of people creating, doing research, publishing research, putting it out there and having conversations around the research. And what I encourage medical doctors is, move away from this trust in other, there's far too much reliance on, oh, well, I read a book by Dr. Jason Fung and he's a doctor, so it must be right. There's this reliance on woo because they're doctors. Know that there is a field there. Have the humility to understand that there are fundamental differences that make it a much more difficult science and a much more difficult science to do well. And start learning from people that are doing that science.
Well, there's a reason why I'm not doing this podcast by myself.
Yeah.
There's a reason. Yeah, you're welcome. Not for your looks. There's a reason why, despite the fact that I'm getting more interested in it, despite the fact I'm reading more around it, I am still not, I can't describe this stuff. And I'm perfectly happy / not so happy, but I'm going to have to swallow my ego. And you're going to talk for a lot of these kind of podcasts because this is the stuff that we need to know. This is the stuff that needs to get out there.
Yeah.
And I can pretend I know what I'm talking about, but the whole thing is that I'm learning from you.
Yeah.
And we, as doctors, again, we like to think that because we're clever enough to have got into medical school, in quotes, that therefore we can just learn if we've learned a little bit about anything, it's fine. We're now the experts at it.
Yeah.
And I think we're one of the easiest cohorts of people and professions to fall into the Dunning-Kruger effect, where we have the ego, unfortunately, as doctors, that means that we have that unbridled confidence in our own abilities. So I actually personally think it takes even less knowledge about something for us to gain a confidence that we know what we're talking about than the general population would. And that's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for disaster, in my opinion.
And another thing to say on that as well that I think is important in terms of looking at research nutritionally. In the biomedical model, epidemiology is very much tarred, and that's because there's been some real scares within, the HRT and cardiovascular disease example in the 80s and early 90s is a good example of that. And so there's this assumption that nutritional epidemiology is just this hocus pocus. You can't control for this. We don't know what the total... Actually, nutritional epidemiology is one of the most complicated. I think it's a beautiful subject because it's so complicated, but it can be done well. And the track record of it in informing public health policy is actually really good. Trans fats have been removed from the food supply largely on the basis of epidemiology coupled with mechanistic studies. There was no RCT to show trans fats were problematic. The removal of our emphasis on total fat in a diet very much came from epidemiology, looking at associations with breast cancer and total fat intake. And that was the first to consistently find no associations with total fat that made us think maybe the composition of fats is important. We had a historic emphasis on saturated fats, but recently we've come more to the understanding of this balance of unsaturated to saturated. We've had so many observations in epidemiology ultimately upheld that I think we warrant confidence in nutritional epidemiology. And there's a few biomedical purists that certainly John Ioannidis at Stanford that have said the only research we should do in nutrition are large, simple randomized controlled trials. And I find that hilarious because, one, going back to the presuppositions I talked about at the start, they would fail all of those presuppositions instantly. Two, if you wanted to do a really large randomized controlled trial in nutrition over the long term, it'll just degenerate into an observational study anyway because it's so behavioral in nature. Because
all of those you can't control.
You can't control. Yeah. So they contradict themselves by recommending these, kind of rather radical approaches. In nutrition, and certainly the diseases that we have facing us now, which we talked about in the last episode briefly, they're diseases of long latency periods. They take a while to develop. Yeah. So prospective cohort studies, which are a population observational form of research, are really important to nutrition science and actually are really informative because they're the only tool we have that can investigate long-term outcomes with diseases that have long latency periods. So they can be done really well, and the methodology is improving, particularly as technology improves. Our ability to quantify diets more objectively is getting better. Our capacity to, record intake is getting a bit better. But even at that, people often dismiss, oh, well, they used a food frequency questionnaire. You understand that food frequency questionnaire is validated in a population against weighted food diaries. It's not just a random questionnaire. There is so much validation that goes into obtaining food frequency questionnaires that are always specific to the population that you're studying. And the NHANES data, the National Health and Examination Nutrition Survey data in America, I mean, it's beautiful how they quantified intake over in terms of the methodology employed. So nutrition is a really, really complex science. It's a hard science. It's all nuances and shades of gray, which is, I think, why I fell in love with it. But know that it is a science. And it's not, on the one hand, you have people who dismiss it as unreliable, but they're the ones that are dismissing it because it doesn't accord, the current evidence base doesn't accord with their worldview. So they're saying we can't rely on, so Zoe Harcombe is a classic example of that, who is one of the lead, I call her the high priestess of the low carb, high fat, just eat bacon and butter and you'll be fine.
A high priestess.
Because it's a religion. So, but her take is we can't rely on epidemiology and we can't rely on RCTs. So it's like, oh, that's an excuse to throw science out the window and say whatever we want. Yeah, exactly. You rely on the innate wisdom of knowing that once upon a time,
of being a doctor.
The logic of once upon a time, our paleo forebears ran around eating ribeyes in the African Rift Valley
because they were common.
Yes. So you and then on the other hand, then you've got the.
How long did they live? Just to clarify,
I think 34. And then on the other hand, then you've got the crowd who dismiss the whole field as unreliable because they want to mount their own perspectives on diet and health. But then you've got the kind of stats or biomed purists who dismiss it because, well, this wasn't controlled for that. We don't truly have a placebo. We don't truly have double blinding. And it's like, we don't have double blinding in nutrition science a lot. We can't. How can you blind everybody to the fact that you're giving them a food to eat or a diet to eat?
Close your eyes and pretend forget
Here
what
comes
this
the airplane.
feels
It's like feeding a baby. Here comes the airplane.
Because if you blended it, and that would probably be the only way, then you would ruin the whole mechanism of food digestion. And then
so
it would only be relevant for blended food.
And these factors are not a limitation. What they mean is that we need to evolve the manner in which we apply the model to nutrition.
Yeah. And we need to have some baseline trust of the people that are trained in analyzing nutritional science
and communicating it and doing it and
just like as doctors, we hope that people have a baseline level of trust in us when we critically analyze biomedical papers, and we get frustrated when people don't.
Yes.
Yet we don't give people the same respect who are trained in nutritional science.
And I always make that, and I think because it's food, it's coming back to this where's the harm thing, right? Imagine I just sat down and started reading up on some drug therapy and formed my own conclusions about it and started communicating those opinions.
You'd probably call it an ACE inhibitor. That's
I probably would, or CO. There was I went to a lifestyle medic conference a couple of years ago and something came up about COPD and I was like, what the fuck is that? I had no idea. I don't know what COPD is.
But you're not a doctor.
I'm not a doctor.
I'm not a nutritionist.
So imagine, but when I say that to people, I'm like, imagine I then went and started talking about this stuff. It would be given no quarter. People would be like, shut your mouth. You don't know what you're talking about. Yet we're expected to excuse it when the shoe's on the other foot.
Yeah, that's exactly what we mean by stay in your lane. Right?
Yes.
It's stay in your lane can be taken too far.
It can.
To mean that no one is allowed to have an opinion unless they've done a PhD in a topic.
And that's not true.
However, stay in your lane can be very important for this precise reason you're talking about.
Exactly.
Where, you start believing that you suddenly own the lane because you're so good and you've learned a little bit and therefore you must teach everybody the intrinsic values and truths you have suddenly found about your identity because everything is a healthism. And it's,
that's it.
I feel like you're going to continue to teach us the importance of knowing how to analyze biomedical science as we go on throughout this series of podcasts.
Yes, and that is, as we said at the outset, we want this to be a channel to healthcare professionals that they can trust, that they're not getting misled, they're not getting hyperbole, they're getting an objective critique of nutrition as it applies to health, and certainly as it may apply in a medical context. And along the way, I think a big part of that is these nuances about the science of it and things to look for. And so, yes, I very much look forward to expanding on these points as we get to discuss different specific areas of research.
That I would imagine that for a lot of people, and for me included, a lot of that sounds relatively complicated. And that's perfectly fine. Like, it's a new field of science, and it's for and you it seems simple, but it is. Yeah, especially for us, it's a new field of science that we're not. We haven't grown up at university learning how to analyze, learning how to understand, and so don't beat yourself up that you don't understand. I'm speaking to the listeners here. Don't beat yourself up that you don't understand all this stuff after hearing Alan talk for half an hour on it, because this stuff is complicated, and the point of this particular podcast is not that, okay, you now know how to read nutritional science, go for it. This is giving you hopefully a baseline understanding of the fact that it's complicated, because I don't think enough people give it enough respect that it deserves. And so when we're then going forward with these podcasts and talking about specific things like fat, like cholesterol, like carbs, that you have an understanding as to why we might be saying certain things, and have a bit of a baseline, and feel free to keep coming back to this episode and listen to it a few times if need be. I know personally I will, and not just through editing it, but just in general, because this is the stuff that we assume that we know when we're reading science around nutrition, and it's the stuff that leads us down the wrong rabbit holes, and it's the stuff that justifies the rhetoric that we form, sometimes unknowingly, incorrectly, and unknowingly in a problematic fashion, because we think we understand what we're reading. Sometimes we do, but a lot of the times, I would argue, with nutritional science, if we don't have a background of learning how to analyze nutritional science, we are going to interpret it through a lens of biomedical science, and that lens will distort, guaranteed will distort the conclusions that we come to, and therefore the potential harm that we then have when we start acting on those conclusions that we've come to. If the whole thing is flawed from the very outset, then we need to start going back to square one. So we need to let go of our ego. Again, I think ego is going to come up several times in these podcasts. We need to let go of our ego of thinking that we're cleverer than the general population. Again, speaking to doctors here, that we are able to just learn this stuff in a heartbeat and it's fine. And also be willing to be wrong. That there are going to be things that we've learned so far that we're going to have to backtrack on, because we've learned it without a basic understanding of nutritional science. And we need to take a step back, just like when it comes to cholesterol. We spent a lot, and we will go into cholesterol in a later podcast, but we spent many, many years as doctors believing that dietary cholesterol was incredibly harmful for our health. And it led to a lot of studies being done with that as a base preposition. And so there are a lot of studies that get used when it comes to arguing for a plant-based diet, that use studies that are inherently and intrinsically flawed from the outset, because they're based on the preposition that dietary cholesterol is harmful. And we can get into some of that stuff. Design. Exactly. And so there are many, 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 many good reasons to be eating more plants, but the lack of dietary cholesterol is not one of them. Exactly. So let's leave ego at the door. Let's be willing to be wrong. Thank you for going through some of that stuff and confusing the hell out of everybody.
My favorite subject.
I know. Well, hopefully that's what we want people that are doing PhDs to have. We want them to have an interest in this stuff they're doing, right?
Yes, but it's all and it's there is some stuff there that I think you re-listen to it. I guess certainly the presupposition stuff, but it will click, and it will click as we go into more examples of particular papers as we're addressing standalone topics as we go through the podcast. But I guess the fundamental point here is just coming back to my opening statement. Nutrition is a science. Recognize that it is. Recognize that it's a standalone field with its own issues, complexities, baseline level of knowledge that's required to contextualize results, and issues that make the biomedical model not necessarily a neat fit for it as a subject of inquiry. And once those things are accepted, then you can start to kind of open up to what those nuances are and start to work through them. And we're going to help you work through them.
Perfect. I hope he's blown your mind, and we'll see you in the next one.
We will.